Hey everyone, happy post-Thanksgiving. I am recording with my Mac right now, my Mac laptop. So I apologize if the quality isn't that good. So I would suggest like adjusting the settings while you watch this video for more clarity. But I wanted to make this a video. It's regarding growing up as a child in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, and its impact on cognitive and brain development, as well as protective factors that can mitigate the consequences of growing up in a high control authoritarian cult like religion like the Iglesia Ni Cristo. So with that being said, I do want to say that I'm going to share a little bit about my lived experience about growing up as a child in the Iglesia Ni Cristo and how that manifested in my life and how it showed up and affected my self-esteem, my self-confidence. And this video is meant to be as like an educational tool as well. So if you are a parent that is raising your child in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, it's important to be aware of the negative impacts that could happen as a result of growing up in a type of religion like this. Not to say that every child is going to have the same symptoms or the same impact, because every child is different and every child has a different personality. I do have a background in child development, so I understand like how every child is different and how certain biosocial and environmental factors can impact the child and as they grow up into adolescence and then later on into adulthood. So with that being said, I just want to give a little bit of context. So when I was growing up as a child in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, like I was offered as a baby. And then I started attending what's known as children's worship service. So I didn't get to attend the adult worship service until I was indoctrinated. I had to I think it was like 12 or 13 where I had to undergo all these indoctrination lessons, and then I was finally baptized. Then I could attend the services twice a week, mandatory, where I had to like flip my name tag. It was very all procedural and super, super strict. So as a child growing up in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, we would have to attend these lessons, these CWS lessons, and it was twice a week. And while the parents were in the adult worship service, like the children all congregated together, and there was like a teacher, there was a choir, the boys and girls were separated. And like after we would sing hymns, then they would pass around these pre-printed out lessons with questions, and then the answers already filled out for the children to repeat in unison. So I'm going to contrast this with like a child attending kindergarten or preschool. The lessons weren't structured in a way where it was reflected open-ended questioning, no room for critical thinking. The questions are already, like I said, pre-filled out for you, and it was almost like a memorization process. So the children would be sitting in the chairs, and then the teacher, who's typically a woman, would go in front of the children, and she would read the question out loud, and the children all in unison all together would have to answer the question. And it wasn't like blanks where it wasn't like the teacher was telling a story, like typically in kindergarten, and then the children are like, oh, I think this, and where they're sharing their opinions and there's room for critical thinking. Typically, the CWS teacher would read a question, and then the children would answer all together. So an example that I remember to this day as a 33-year-old woman is them asking, who is God's last messenger in these last days? That question popped up a lot. There were a lot of themes around the church administration and how we would have to like memorize that Felix Y. Manalo was God's last messenger in these last days. So that was ingrained early on as a child, as my brain is still developing, that this is the truth. Like Felix Y. Manalo is God's last messenger in these last days. So that's the only thing I remember from those lessons. And that says a lot. Like I don't remember like them telling stories about morals or being kind to your neighbor. Like those were themes that were never really taught. It was mainly about the church administration and Felix Y. Manila was God's last messenger in these last days. Like that was like the resounding message they wanted to really ingrain in our heads as children. So how is that a negative impact? Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share a presentation with you from a researcher called, her name is Jill Harvey. She has her master's degree. And let me go ahead and pull it up. So I think this slide can give a lot of insight into how a high control religion or a cult-like religion can impact a child and their cognitive brain development. So in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, a lot of these themes are taught. Okay, even as an adolescent, these themes were taught too. Even in the adult worship service, these themes were taught as well. It just so happens that it started early on as a child. So these, you have, as you can see the diagram here, the child's brain. It says closed religious environment, childhood religious indoctrination. So here's the child's brain, and from a very early age, the themes of fear, shame, and guilt are ingrained in you. So from a very, very young age, the idea of hell and going to the lake of fire, I remember those three words, the lake of fire, because they would always, always, always promote that if we didn't obey our parents, we would go to the lake of fire. And so those messages were really taught to me at a very young age, taught to a lot of my colleagues and friends from a very young age, about damnation, evil, the end of times, like the world is going to end soon. Shame and guilt were taught to us. And then, okay, so it's like a double whammy, because as a Filipino child too, shame and guilt in the Asian culture is also taught. Like those practices are taught to you. Like if you don't obey your parents, if you don't go to church, like then shame and guilt are some common emotions that children will feel. How this impacts critical thinking is when there's no room for the child to ask questions, when there is no room for the child to be validated for having different viewpoints, that can repress critical thinking skills. It can also, here on the bottom, it says harmful childcare practices that can occur. And so when you have your parents listening to these sermons and they are reinforcing these messages within the home, sometimes it can impact the parents to the point where, especially if the parents are more authoritarian and they're not very empathetic, and they're just like, this is what I say, this is what goes, then harsh punishment can occur on both ends within the home and at church. So the child is not feeling heard, they're not feeling validated, and that can impact their emotional health. It can impact the way they relate to others in the future, in their romantic relationships, and their career. Especially like when they go to work in places where there's a hierarchy. A lot of the times, I know this is true for me, but I would people please my authority figures a lot, because in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, you're really taught to people please a lot of the time. And that is something I'm still trying to heal. And then it can also impact your sexual development, and your social development as well. A lot of the times in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, they, how do I say it? So it's not like they don't encourage you to have outside relationships, but they kind of pin you as like the chosen people and everyone else as like outsiders. So you might be, as a child in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, you might have this like superiority complex where you're like, I'm the chosen one and everyone else is going to go to hell because you're not an INC member. And that can be very, very, like very damaging to have that type of superiority, I got the golden ticket type of deal situation happening. And also can lead you to be mistrustful of others as well, as you grow into adolescence. And then here, a lot of the times in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, it's all religious indoctrination, right? So they're not talking about science, and we're not talking about history. We're not talking about Filipino culture. That was one thing I really was deprived of in Iglesia Ni Cristo. Like, we're not a majority of the Iglesia Ni Cristo members are Filipino. So I'm really missed out on like my Filipino culture and my heritage, because most of the time all the lessons revolved around the church administration and obeying God and obeying Felix Y. Manalo and the last messenger. Like, I didn't know about the history of my people until I went to college. So I was really deprived of those like practices of that my Filipino culture as well. So with that being said, these are a lot of negative impacts that can affect the child as they grow into adolescence, as they grow into adults. And usually the trauma that occurs as a child will resurface as an adult, and it can manifest in your relationships. And that's what happened to me, which are, is another topic for another video. But I believe this diagram is so, so, so important, and can really, really, really just highlight how it can impact a child. So now I'm going to move on to the protective factors that can mitigate the negative impact of growing up in the Iglesia Ni Cristo as a child. So a lot of the times in the Iglesia Ni Cristo, your feelings are invalidated, and if you don't really share the same beliefs as the members, then you're ostracized and you're made to feel guilty. You experience a lot of shame and guilt as a result of having doubts, or a result of leaving, or say you're gay and you leave, and you might experience like a lot of emotional upheaval and pain and sorrow, because you don't align with the teachings anymore, or you don't resonate with the teachings anymore. But a protective factor is if you have a family that's very empathetic and isn't super, super into the doctrines. So say you have a family that's going to church, but they're not like super, super religious. And they're like, I'm just going to church because it's like an automatic, like I've been going since I was a kid and I don't question it type of thing. And they have a child that's gay, right? So they might be like, you know what? I still love you, son. I still love you, daughter. And I don't really care what the minister says. I still love you, son. So that is a protective factor, because even though they're hearing these negative messages from the church and these really shameful messages about who they are as a person, if their family is empathetic, is attuned to the child's emotional needs, that can mitigate some of the anxiety and the depression. For me, unfortunately, as I was experiencing doubts, and I would turn to my mom and like share my thoughts, I was invalidated. So how do I say it? It negatively impacted me, and my other parent wasn't present to attune to me, to attune to my emotional needs. So I experienced a lot of anxiety and depression as a result. So that's a protective factor, having a parent or family that's more empathetic to your needs and more understanding of your needs. Okay, that can really combat the negative impact of the shame and guilt that the toxic doctrines introduce to these children and these adolescents. And these young adults too. It's not just children. Another protective factor, and this is huge, I really will emphasize this, and I will say this as a protective factor among the Filipino American community, is education. And why I say that is because Filipinos, they really, really are big on education. They want their children and their sons to get a higher education. They want their children to be successful. So when you have these toxic doctrines that are being taught to your children, what can mitigate the effects of it is being introduced to philosophy, is being introduced to science, is being introduced to history, is being introduced to psychology. Like a lot of Filipinas are nurses, and they are introduced to psychology, culture, science, critical thinking, that can all minimize these toxic doctrines, because your critical thinking skills are like they're being molded and they're being practiced. So that's another protective factor. And it was for me, because I'm such an academic. I love learning, I love reading, I love understanding different cultures, different perspectives, and that was a savior for me to not really not to say I wasn't depressed or I didn't suffer from anxiety, but it introduced me to a new world where I could create my own narrative and my own reality and separate myself from the toxic unhealthy, coercive practices of the Iglesia Ni Cristo. It saved me. So those are two protective factors. Having a family that's more empathetic and supportive to your needs and is emotionally attuned to you. And then education is a huge one as well, because it teaches you all the things that the Iglesia Ni Cristo tries to inhibit your child from learning. So that is something I wanted to discuss, because children are very, very impressionable. You know, when they are introduced to topics at a very young age, they're going to go along with it because that's what their parents are telling them to do. But when they reach adolescence and they start to think for themselves, that's where problems can occur. And this tug of war struggle of what the fuck do I believe in? I'm sorry for cursing. Like, who the fuck am I? Do I really believe in these doctrines that I'm being taught? Can happen. And not to say that every child is going to experience this, but I don't want to say it won't happen, because there's a possibility that this could happen to your child, because it happened to me. I'm a living result, and a lot of people have these same experiences. And you know, if you have a child in the Iglesia Ni Cristo and they're questioning, doubting, just think about this diagram that I showed you through it was created by Jill Harvey, who is a researcher on religious indoctrination and religious trauma. Want to give her props for this diagram because I think it's so super informative. And your child is not evil. Your child, there's nothing wrong with your child, you know, if they decide to create a different landscape and path for themselves. So that is what I'm going to end on. I hope this brings some clarity. I hope it can provide some really educational, tool. I hope it can be used as an educational tool for yourself to really reflect and think about the negative impacts it can have on a child. So, you know, if you have 3 children that grow up in the Iglesia Ni Cristo and one stays and one decides to leave, it doesn't mean that one child is bad, you know, for them leaving. Because what if, you know, that child has a really, really negative impact, especially if they have a personality type that's more empathetic and more curious and inquisitive. Like, they're not bad for being inquisitive and wanting to explore different concepts and ideas. So I hope that this video can be of hope, a resource for you. And if you have any questions, comments, definitely you're always welcome to leave them in the comment section below. And I hope you have a great day. Bye.